And we're back. This is chapter 8. This is the 5th video, chapter 8 of investing in the book Liberate, Your Journey to Lasting Financial Independence. And we're going to continue with balancing risk and return, prioritizing goals over diversification. So let's continue with a scenario where you determine that you need an 8% return to achieve financial independence. Suppose two investments have similar long-term returns of 8%. In that case, you want to take whichever has the lowest risk. But suppose you have the choice between one investment with a long-term return of 8% and a risk or standard deviation of 15%, and another investment with a long-term return of 6% and a risk or standard deviation of 10%. In this case, you will not want to choose the investment with the lower risk because a 6% return will not achieve your goal. This idea is simple on paper, but gets confusing in practice because asset allocation is commonly framed as the way to diversify investments properly. The concept that is often lost during all this talk about diversification is that you can over-diversify with assets that don't have the return potential you need to meet your required rate of return. Adding additional assets for diversification is inappropriate if that mix has not historically been able to achieve the long-term returns you need to accomplish your FI. Thus, you only add assets capable of maintaining your desired long-term required return. Imagine 3 assets to stoke your investment income engine: stocks with an 8% long-term return, bonds with a 4% long-term return, and a third asset, asset X, which also offers an 8% long-term return. While stocks and asset X are uncorrelated and share similar volatility, stocks and bonds are also uncorrelated, but with bonds exhibiting lower volatility. Now suppose you try to diversify with a 50% stock and 50% bond portfolio. In that case, your long-term expected weighted average return is 6%, which is less than your 8% required rate of return. There is no simple solution to increase the long-term return of this portfolio without increasing its risk. There may be years when the portfolio returns are above or below the 6% average. Still, in the long term, the averages will prevail. Now for the next scenario. Suppose you diversify with a portfolio of 50% stocks and 50% asset X. In that case, your weighted average long-term return is 8%, the same as your required rate of return. The only reason asset allocation diversification worked in this second example is because both assets included in the portfolio had the long-term ability to achieve the required rate of return. Okay, let me just go back up here and just explain this real quickly. So comparison of weighted average portfolio returns. Here's the return 0 to 8% as an example. And then in this first example, portfolio A, we have 50% stocks and 50% bonds. So the money that's allocated, that's how it's divided. And right here we have stocks have an average return of 8%, and we're adding that to bonds with an average return of 4%. And because they're 50-50 weighted, we can just add those, basically take half of that return, right? Is going to be 4% plus 2% equals the weighted return of 6%. Okay. Versus portfolio B is 50% stocks plus 50% of asset X, which has a similar risk return profile, although it's not perfectly correlated. They both return 8%, therefore, right, 50% here is going to be 4%, and then 50% of asset X is 4% weighted, and so that weighted return is going to be 8%. Okay, so we were able to add 2 assets together and still get that 8% because asset X had that potential, whereas bonds, right, we know their long-term return being, conservatively, is 4%, versus stocks being conservative at 8%, that we can't get up to that 8% return by adding those 2 assets together in this example. Okay, focusing on balancing risk and return can be helpful when comparing similar investments or during the distribution phase when you need more stable returns. However, it should not be your primary objective during the accumulation phase. Instead, your first priority must be ensuring that your chosen investments generate a sufficient return to meet your financial independence goals. Why? A decent return is necessary to grow your money, or you will have to contribute much more or work a lot longer to achieve FI. At some point, you must accept that some level of risk is necessary to achieve a decent rate of return. Eliminating all risks may also eliminate most returns. That is why it is crucial to recognize when enough is enough in balancing risk and return. While it is tempting to prioritize safety, overly conservative choices can compromise your ability to meet long-term goals. Remember that asset allocation is not just a matter of adding a bunch of random assets together for the sake of diversification. It ensures that the assets you add to your portfolio can provide the long-term returns you require to meet your FI goal. It is such a simple concept, but it can be confusing when you see a colorful pie chart all cut up into different slices demonstrating the principle of asset allocation. It can be really alluring. You see slices that say U.S. stocks, U.S. bonds, cash, and a few other assets in the mix, all with their corresponding percentages. It all looks so diversified, which it is, but you don't just want asset allocation for the sake of diversification. You want an asset allocation that meets your required rate of return. You want to start with the end in mind. So while that colorfully sliced portfolio pie looks so enticing, you must remember that your required rate of return comes before asset diversification. Yes, your choice of asset allocation determines your long-term average return. Historically, over the long run, adding bonds or cash to your stock fund will drag the long-term average down. So forget about the appearance of a nicely illustrated pie chart and ask yourself, historically, will this asset allocation choice get me my required rate of return? If the answer is no, you either have the wrong assets or too much allocated to the wrong assets. Remember, when deciding between portfolios with similar long-term average returns, it's natural to prefer the one with the best risk-adjusted return, right? The one with the less volatility. But if you require a long-term return of 8% using diversified funds and it is more volatile than the investment portfolio with a 6% return, you must still choose the 8% option to achieve your goal. All right, we're going to pause there and pick up the hidden cost of reducing volatility, inflation risk in the next video. Thanks for being here with me.